Now, these quotes come from a recent biography of Mao by Zhang Rong and John Holliday, who had access to the Chinese Communist Party archives from the 50s and 60s and 70s. And she's the son of a fairly high, she's the daughter of fairly high-ranking Communist Party apparatchiks. They remark about these quotes, quote, "Mao dominated China, he intended to dominate the world." Now, we know from our own history that the character of the founder of a country deeply influences that country's future. We are very blessed to have as our founder George Washington, who refused to be king and who voluntarily relinquished power after 8 years in Washington, D.C., a standard that all politicians, in my view, should follow. Most don't. But even today, Mao's picture dominates Tiananmen Square. His legacy is carefully protected by the Chinese Communist Party, and his views have never been entirely repudiated. You all recognize this figure. This is the 1 yuan note, the $1 note in China. And it has a picture on it of Chairman Mao. So these are his views, and I believe that his views are shared by the current leadership. Now, it may sound like what? Like he's a raving lunatic. I mean, here he is in charge of this dirt poor country, sure, rich in resources, with many, many people, but he can only make small arms, and he's dreaming of global conquest. But one has to remember where he's coming from. He's coming from a culture and a people who have a history of dominating Asia for over 2,000 years. Once China came together as a unified country, 2 centuries before the birth of Christ, China became the largest, most powerful, economically most developed empire in the world, and it remained that way for most of the succeeding 2,000 years. And so from the Chinese point of view, the Chinese weakness that we know from our contact with China in the 19th century, where they were defeated in 1840 in the First Opium War, defeated again in 1860 in the Second Opium War, defeated again by the Japanese, defeated before then by the French, defeated after that by Japan in Korea, defeated again by the Japanese in Manchuria, and then in World War II. That whole history of weakness, from the long-term point of view of someone who was conscious of China's imperial history, is an aberration. That's not China. China, in his view, was the largest, most powerful, dominant country in the region. And it had always dominated during times of dynastic resurgence, its known world. And so he now had unified China, and he was determined to restore China to its natural place in the world. What is its natural place in the world in the view of the Communist Chinese leadership? Its natural place in the world is at its center. That's what China means. Zhongguo means the kingdom in the middle kingdom, the central kingdom, which might be translated the dominant kingdom. So, now do we have any statements to this effect? Well, we have a few. I mean, there is a lot of secrecy surrounding Chinese military designs. But a couple of things are clear. First of all, the Chinese government has in place a patriotic education program. You remember the Tiananmen massacre. 1989, you had 1 million people in Beijing, and millions of people in other major cities throughout China demonstrating for an end of bureaucratism, an end to corruption, and respect for human rights and democracy. When you criticize bureaucratism and corruption in China, you are criticizing the Chinese Communist Party, even if you don't name it, because it is a byword in China for corruption, and bureaucratism and corruption are bywords for the Communist Party. Realizing that they had lost control of young people. In 1991, they put in place a patriotic education program, and I won't go into detail on this, but the Chinese leadership realized that it had lost the battle for the hearts and minds of Chinese youth. They ordered that all students in China receive an education in patriotism. Now, in practice, this education of patriotism, which has been in place for 15 years, which begins in kindergarten and goes through college, consists of two things: loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party and its ideals of a rich country and a strong military, and two, suspicion of U.S. ideals of the free market and democracy. The patriotic education program is designed to create in the minds of impressionable young people a strong sense of historical grievance towards the West in general and the U.S. in particular. Chinese young people learn about China's historical greatness, and they absorb the view that only under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party can China recover its lost greatness. Now, these textbooks were approved by the leadership, and the leadership presumably shares the views expressed in these textbooks. Now, China is very secretive about its grand design, but the Chinese Communist Party, like all communist parties, is basically a war party. I mean, what do I mean by that? You know, it means they come to power by force. They stay in power by force and by the threat of force, and they're constantly preparing to use force, and they're prone to use force in responding to domestic crises and external challenges. What does a democracy do to resolve problems? Well, we sit down and we negotiate and we compromise. That's the nature of democracy. What do communist parties do to solve problems? Well, they have a tendency to use the threat of force or actual force. China has bloody borders. Remember, in the last 50 years, China has gone to war with nearly all of its neighbors. India, 1961. Tibet, it invaded Tibet in the early 1950s. Korea against South Korea and us. Russia, the Russian border classes, 1968 to 1969. So we have a communist party in power. Finally, you know, the evidence that China is prepared to do more militarily than just take Taiwan is that China is acquiring the means to project force far beyond Taiwan. They're acquiring weapons designed to exploit U.S. vulnerabilities, and are beginning to build a military presence in Southeast Asia, naval bases in Burma, naval base now in Pakistan, neatly bracketing India on both sides. Military presence, not a military presence yet, but certainly a diplomatic and economic presence at the Panama Canal, strategic choke point. I just wrote an article about the Chinese diplomatic advances in the Caribbean, where they are building expensive embassies in every tiny Caribbean nation that they can. They go in and offer $100 million in aid. The nation breaks ties with Taiwan and establishes ties with the PRC. And they come in and build an embassy, staff it with 5 or 10 or 15 people in a nation where there are 50,000 people or 100,000 people. They have embassy staffs of 5 and 10 people. We have one embassy in Barbados to cover St. Lucia, Dominica, Grenada, and those other countries. They now have an embassy in every country, major foreign aid going into those countries. They're building national soccer stadia. They're engaging in public works projects. Chinese construction battalions are coming in. Chinese immigration is picking up. Why are they doing this? Why is China on the march in the Caribbean? Well, anyone who remembers the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1961 probably has an inkling of why they're interested in developing close ties to these countries. But another reason is sheer diplomacy. I mean, they want votes in the UN. They want a China bloc in the UN. They want protection against World Trade Organization sanctions. They joined the World Trade Organization 5 years ago. They have not kept their promises in terms of opening their markets. And we will at some point, hopefully sooner rather than later, file a complaint under the World Trade Organization rules. But it takes 62% of the member nations to convict a country of violating the rules. And if China has votes from Grenada and St. Lucia and Dominica and lots of these small countries where it has diplomatic missions and large foreign aid projects, then perhaps it can escape sanctions.